Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson, and joining me again is friend of the show and periodic co-host, Charles Siegel, of the Storyteller's Vault, of M20 Sorcerer, and of patreon.com/Charles Siegel. And today we are doing a installment in our periodic Mage How Do Gooder series. And this one is simply entitled Adjudicating Effects. And this is the topic where when I posted it in the Discord, I saw the most number of things at the bottom that said, several people are typing, and then no questions came through. And I totally get that. So I guess my first question is, how do you introduce the idea of the sphere system to players who may be encountering it for the first time and help them build their first effects?
And so for just the high level introduction, I actually wrote a Storyteller Vault supplement that is how I have been doing it. It's the 9 spheres. I made handouts for players that are the descriptions of what the spheres do. I also usually highlight one of the kind of showpiece third dot effects for each sphere. Because though there are plenty of cool things you can do with less, when people who don't know Mage are thinking about magic, they're thinking about more powerful things than the things that most second dots do. So for instance, if someone asks me, well, what can you do with correspondence? At correspondence 3, you can teleport. At mind 3, you can do telepathy. At forces 3, you can do fireball. And ignore the nuance of prime 2 or starting with a little fire or whatever. Just the general idea of here's a big flashy vulgar thing that you can do at the third dot of the sphere, which is the highest you can start with according to the standard character creation rules. And with new players, I strongly recommend that they start with Arete 3 and one sphere at 3 that does the flashy thing that they like best.
My method of introduction is generally to give an overview of what 1 dot does, what 3 dots do, what 5 dots do, and then give them the common magical effects chart from M20. It's a good summary. It covers a lot of things that most games are going to have. It is a handout that kind of is the atomic bit I then use to help players build effects. The other thing is, if they are familiar with another game, we will walk through how to reconstruct some marquee abilities in that, or if their character is based on an archetype of some sort, like, oh, I want to play a Jim Butcher character from the Dresden Files or something like that. I will be like, okay, I will go to a wiki, find out what that character has done, and then break down what that is. There are some cases where that just doesn't work. Like if a character makes a lot of magical items that are obviously talismans or gadgets or something like that, that's generally outside of the regular domain, but then we can talk about kind of other ways to get there. That tends to be the area where it kind of runs into problems. The other key thing is we talk about how starting out, you have a small dice pool. The power stat, you just roll it by itself. So you can do a little version of a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah, one thing I'll say regarding the people who want to make lots of magic items types of characters, I guide them to Sorcerer. Path of Enchantment lets them do that very effectively, and you then have to prepare to do a mixed game with sorcerers and mages, possibly, but it's easier than some other kinds of mixed games would be. And sometimes when a player says, I want to do X, the correct thing to do is, then don't play a mage.
Yeah. I want to be a shapeshifter who defends the earth. I may have a different game for you. I want to gain power by consuming the life force of others and only be active for half the time, and also be emo and attractive. I have a different game for you.
Changeling.
Yeah, yes. Kind of the next key thing when building effects to me is, should paradigm change sphere requirements? How does the instruments you use come into play? We all have strong feelings about the bit of spirit sidebar that is in... What is that? How do you do that?
Yeah.
Which basically says, hey, if you want to do an effect and you think it involves talking to a spirit to get it done, you should add Spirit 2 to it. Or, to me, in the games I like to run, if you're doing something through an organization, do you have to add mind or forces or correspondence or data to everything because you're syndicating out like a battle plan to a bunch of people in high detail seemingly instantaneously? Does paradigm change sphere requirements? Before we address this, I'm going to back up one step and talk about the difference between results and process-based effects. And these are kind of the two big theories for adjudicating what spheres are required. Results-based just looks at the end state of the effect. If a method gets you from point A to point B quickly, it's correspondence 3, whether or not it's a teleporter or a taxi cab or a fighter jet, but since it's correspondence 3, it's only you. If a method heals you, it's life 3, if that involves being able to immediately summon a nearby ambulance to respond with preternatural speed or medical nanites that you happen to have in your bloodstream. That's just life 3. This allows for the phrase I wrote down was wildly subtle, but it becomes, to me, hard to adjudicate because what is an effect? For instance, you can have a magical effect that at the end of the day, the chain of causality it triggers results in somebody being injured in some way. And you're like, did I just do an very extended damage effect in the process of that? And it gets hard to do. Process-based looks at how you get to an outcome. So using the taxi to get from point A to point B quickly, there's kind of two approaches. You can use correspondence 3 to find a taxi cab, mind 2 or 3 to nudge the person in your area, and entropy 3 so that they kind of get all green lights or something like that, or forces or whatever methodology you want to have for the go fast, especially if you're like correspondence 3 through Midtown Manhattan traffic, which regardless of the taxi method would still be vulgar in my opinion. So my feelings on this are generally that you don't need spheres to interface with your instruments and practices. If spirits are your instruments and spirit talking is a practice of yours, you don't need spirit to talk to them for a non-spirit effect. To vaguely quote a friend of the show, James Sembrano, your spheres represent, if you're an animist of a certain type, represent the peoples whose ways you have learned and the relationships you have cultivated. If you use a forces effect and the medium is a spirit, it just means you know how to talk to spirits related to forces. The spirit sphere does not somehow now totalize and give access to everything. This, to me, also answers the problem that occurs in a lot of games. How do I prevent my players from using Spirit 2 to solve every problem? There are in-game ways of doing it, but this, to me, is the systematic way of doing it. Well, spirits have domains, and just because you have Spirit 2 does not give you plenary access to interface with and talk with all spirits throughout the Tellurian. If you accomplish something through organizational effects, you don't need to use mind and correspondence if they are already represented as a practice and an instrument. So if you have management or HR as an instrument of yours or business processes, that is already baked in. You don't need to add that. And that would allow a character for whom that is the instrument they use to be able to do the effect more simply than another character who may try and get an organization to do something where that is not one of their instruments. So if a character that does not have HR or organizational management, now they need correspondence mind and a whole bunch of other things to try and get that ball rolling. It is not in the same way baked into their magic. There's some ridiculous places where this can go, where a character says, well, rocket launchers are my focus or something like that. And you're like, well, yes, but now we need to come up with a way of adjudicating you having rocket launchers, which aren't terribly great. But that tends to be my starting point. The other thing is your spheres may change if you're working around a restriction in your paradigm. So, for instance, there is the chi punch in How Do You Do That, which is basically a punch that does regular forces damage but requires a point of quint. That is you working around the idea in your paradigm that all expressions of magical force require quintessence in some way. So for me, that kind of addition or codicil is perfectly fine because it is in time with it. The spheres represent a minimum requirement. I tend not to deviate from those heavily. Charles, what do you think about results and process-based effects, and how do you change sphere requirements for paradigm, if at all?
So this is one of the things that I'm kind of multiple minds on. I don't want to say 2 because it's mage.
Yeah. I am of N minds on.
Limitless N goes to infinity.
Yeah.
The issue I have is that if you stay strictly on either process-based or results-based determinism, you do run into nonsense eventually. I'd say eventually, but it doesn't take that long. The correspondence 3 to hail a cab example has been mocked in the text of Mage. But on the other hand, if you're a hermetic who is calling upon the power of fire elementals in order to burn down a building, that's a forces effect, not a spirit effect.
And as a note, I had an NPC that was basically a logisticsomancer, and they were allowed to use Correspondence 3 to do that. Their instrument was mass transit and city transportation systems, so they used to wild success on a number of occasions. Sorry, I just wanted to note that almost in defiance of that example, I have allowed that in my game, and I think it made sense at the time.
So my solution is that I don't strictly follow either. Is, as I said, that gets to nonsense pretty quickly, and then the question is where to lean when. Part of it is just a feeling of, well, if I lean in that direction on this example, it'd be very stupid. And although that's not a hard rule that can really be written down for things, it does let you say things like, well, this guy's entire paradigm is that they are able to make things happen in bureaucracies and organizations. The sort of thing that New World Order and Syndicate types would be doing constantly. They can use Correspondence to hail a cab. An Aetheryte is not using Correspondence 3 to hail a cab, at least not the average Aetheryte on the street. When it comes to what the spheres can do, I tend to be on the permissive side. If a player presents me with, I want to do this, and I believe that these spheres should allow me to do it, which I have, then I will always listen to the case they make. And as long as during that they, one, don't contradict anything that I have, made clear about the game, don't actively contradict the book. Like no saying, well, I can do this with Forces 2. That's a nuclear explosion. But Forces 2, and this is important, they don't say anything that flagrantly violates things they have said about their character's paradigm. Then I will usually allow them to do what they want the spheres to do. And then how kind of appropriate it is for that sphere combination to do it versus, I guess, how results-based versus process-based does play a role in when I assign a target number of successes. So like I would say that using Core 3 to hail a cab, unless you are that logistics mancer, is harder success-wise than using Correspondence 3 to teleport. But that has higher difficulty and is vulgar. So I do like giving players trade-offs like that too.
I also think it is the case that you can run Mage as a game about the consequences of failure, the trade-offs of success, or the perils of success. And all of those are permissible ways of running the game, and I think will inform that. Yeah. If you want the game to be about the problems of success, you are constantly giving the players what they want. And it can go to farce, but it can also go to hubristic morality play very quickly when players start getting what they want and realizing maybe it isn't what they want. Making it about trade-offs is one of those things where, like, yes, this effect worked, but these people now know about you. This spirit is angry about you. Your avatar has this concern. And making it a game about failure kind of is a game of strict adjudication. Or at least those are mechanical ways to align your view of the game with how you want to adjudicate effects.
You can probably tell from my answer and then what you said that I tend to run the game as at what price success? What have you given up to accomplish your goal? So you can take the harder route, call the cab with Core 3, and you're being subtle, you're flying under the radar, no paradox, etc. Or you can teleport. It solves your problem faster. It takes fewer success, though at higher difficulty, and it's up to you to figure out whether that's worth it, mathematically. But you've just done something vulgar. There's paradox. There are people who, like, my solution to the old Manar problem is that it doesn't detect magic use, it detects paradox generation.
Could you quickly explain the Manar problem?
So, in first edition, the technocracy had satellites that detected magic.
First edition kind of worked with the assumption that everyone had arcane out of necessity. That was the only way you were going to survive, or you needed to be some Rambo-like character.
Yeah, and the technocracy had functionally infinite resources back then. They had magic detecting satellites. So one solution to the problem of if they can just detect magic, how do the PCs survive? Is they can detect the generation of paradox. That way, the PCs can survive by being subtle. Yeah, the solution I came up with was they detect paradox, which means that anytime you generate paradox, you run the risk of the technocracy noticing you. And that does change quite a few things about how the game runs. Like, you're going to work more in your sanctum after that. And that trade-off between calling a cab versus teleporting is a lot higher stakes if generating paradox gets attention, especially in revised rules where you generate more paradox. And naturally, if you generate more paradox, you should be easier to detect.
QV the comment on Maynard. Another thing Charles has mentioned is the focus to use that effect happens to be a satellite that costs $100 million an hour to operate, which can kind of rein it in. And also smash cut to the future episode of Mage talking about mashing up Mage and Blades in the Dark that I swear I will do at some point, and the heat system that game has. So moving on, now here's a broad one. What general guidelines do you use when adjudicating what spheres are required?
And other than the things that are explicitly there and a few changes I've made to the sphere system over the years because I just don't like where certain powers are located, I do tend to just err on the side of being permissive with the spheres. Someone asks, can I do this with this set of spheres? Unless I have some reason specifically to say, no, you can't. Like, the rules say explicitly that you cannot do that. As I said earlier, I tend to allow it. So I think someone made a comment about how saying no is kind of taboo to mage players. And I don't know, I've never had any problem saying no to someone who asked to do something just actually unreasonable. But I will usually say that with whatever, say, if someone asks, can I do X? I'll say either, yeah, you can do that with your spheres. Here's the number of successes. And sometimes that number is prohibitively high. I have literally had players ask me, how many successes do I need to blow up the moon? And the answer is generally more. If I conclude that the spheres they have can't do what they want, I tend to suggest, well, here's a smaller thing you could do. So yeah, you can't fire off a nuke with forces 2, but you could light something on fire. And let's see if that's maybe enough to solve the problem you're dealing with.
For me, kind of my general rules are, one, does it match something we already have? Do we already have a canon effect that says it's that? If the effect is something that's on the common sphere effects, I will start with that. Rotes, I tend to raise my eyebrow at. Those tend to be often maximal in that they include a lot of additional spheres that I wouldn't necessarily view as being required. Again, especially if I can cobble it together from the common sphere effect chart. There are certain additional things that kind of just get added to rotes that I'm kind of waffle on. Like sometimes prime is required, but nothing is being created. Sometimes mind 3 is required, but nothing is being continuously controlled, or entropy 3 is required and no real element of exceptional luck seems to come into play. Those seem to be the most common ones.
And there's also a lot of extraneous spirit.
The other general rules I kind of look at is if you're trying to do more than an established effect, it should probably require more. If it requires less, if it's less than established effect, it should probably require less, which may sound stupid, but it's one of those things where sometimes the next closest effect that you can find, the character doesn't have reach to, but maybe they can get close. Another general rule I follow is that this is not stated, but something that pops up a lot. You can often use 2 spheres at a lower level to do what 1 sphere can do at a higher level. Correspondence 3 is required to kind of move around just a houseplant, or Correspondence 2 Life 2. You can teleport someone else with Correspondence 3 Life 3, or just Correspondence 4. Prime 5 can give you extra health levels, or Prime 4 Life 4. So I am frequently a fan of using that, and I will have more examples of this later.
Other rules similar to that I use that I don't think have ever actually been explicitly stated, but are kind of implied by other things that have been written. If sphere X is enough to do it for you, X plus 1 can do it to anyone else. This one's specific to wonder creation because that's an area I enjoy, but that the rules are, well, we talked about how wonder creation you probably just want to play a sorcerer for.
Yeah.
I tend to rule that what you can do with quintessence and prime X, you can do with TAS and prime X minus 1, which means that a starting character can make a talisman if they have appropriate TAS rather than just access to quintessence.
Yeah. And I think another homebrew you and I run with is we also generally make prime more useful in that it allows you to make a thing more itself, which can manifest in all sorts of neat ways.
Yeah, I tend to do that, and I tend to make it both more like itself, but worse at being anything else.
Yeah.
So like this this platonically perfect screwdriver is in fact a very bad jar opener.
Yeah. Is a very, very bad knife. I am pleased that that is something you and I independently kind of converged on. Prime, it makes everything more like it's in the High Umbra.
Here's a question for you, more or less than the thing in the chart. I ask this only because I've had arguments with people about whether this effect should be life 2 or life 4. Causing pain, but not damage. Is that more than doing damage or less than doing damage to you?
To me, that's less than doing damage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I usually adjudicate that as life 2, but I've heard people make strong arguments that it's life 4 because it's more delicate.
Yeah. One of the rules I will get to later is what is the actual system effect on the game, which can also lead us to weird places.
Yeah.
Another one is, does it leverage a contradiction? This is kind of a weird one, but one to keep in mind. M20 Core and How Do You Do That and Book of Secrets and a few other books don't agree with each other. Sometimes it is obvious to me that they figured out something. For instance, Mind is now frequently described as Mind 2, get someone to do something they would do anyway. Mind 3, get them to do something that they could do. Mind 4, you can change someone's mind completely. Mind 5, you rewrite them as a person. That is not something I have found in the interpretation of the core, but has occurred on more than one occasion from the rotes that came later. And that's kind of a general idea, but it also came with the idea, I can't remember where this was first introduced. I think it actually comes up in Book of the Fallen, basically using mind effects to knock people across the spectrum, where you get them to do something they were probably going to do, and then you leverage that to get them to do something they were ambivalent about, and then you leverage that, which I think is a great thing in that it reinforces how the Nefandi work. But it becomes tedious and requires housekeeping, and yeah.
It also kind of ends up in a situation where on some level you're using a Mind 2 effect as your instrument for a Mind 3 effect.
Yeah.
And if you can really just ratchet up like that, then that Mind already is kind of a messy sphere for many reasons involving Mind 1.
Another one is 2 areas where I found the rules to be particularly inconsistent outside of that mind thing, which to me, I don't think it is inconsistent so much as they figured it out and now it went a particular way. Blessings and curses go back and forth as between being entropy 3 and entropy 4. Entropy 3 seems to be generic, good thing, bad thing, and entropy 4 seems to be more specific stuff. And weather control, which can take anywhere between 1 and 11 spheres, seemingly.
I'm just going to take a second and make another pitch for Sorcerer, just pointing out that anytime you run into an effect that requires like 30 spheres to do it, there's a path for that.
Yeah. The other thing I do is I can consult the sphere clarifications Google Doc that floats around the internet where someone has gone through, I don't know who, and has said, like, well, this book says this is how I house ruled it. I ignore the house rule portion because I'm generally not in favor of complicated house rules. Another thing I do is, and I will include a link to that in the show notes, another thing I do is ask what the effect does, like what you're trying to do, and you can frequently sidestep it. Someone can say, I want to call down lightning to kill that guy. It's like, well, what are you actually trying to do? Are you just trying to electrocute someone? You can do that with like Forces 3 or Forces 3 Matter 3 if you want to do it through like Stray Ground Current or like Correspondence 2. Forces 2. If they want to summon lightning for a specific reason, I'm generally going to require Forces 4 to get that level of like weather control. But if they simply want to do something impressive with forces, I'm fine doing it at a lower level. So the question is this being done for flavor or is this being done instrumentally? If a character wants to summon a proper hurricane because they want to soak the eastern seaboard, yeah, I'm now going to require Forces 5, Entropy 3, Correspondence 3, and to pull that off, and possibly Mind to hold it together.
Successes?
Yeah, but if a character just wants the single lightning bolt they summon to look really impressive, sure, you're fine. Just use forces. Now, this gets us into the annoying place of saying, well, in this case, it required one set of spheres. In that case, it required another set of spheres. To me, the justification for that is the character is merely stipulating what it looked like, and they could do that effect again for Forces 4, and it could wind up looking different. When you're doing the full-blown weather control, you're stipulating how it also needs to look. Another thing I kind of keep in mind is I have this vague hierarchy in my head of what magic can do. At the highest level, just having the spheres let you do it. This almost never happens. I will sometimes do this as a gimme in a game because I don't want people to roll. The next thing is it lets you do it with a magic roll. This is the most common thing. This is how standard effects go. It lets you do it, but it costs something. Maybe you need to spend a point of quintessence, willpower, or health to do it. So for instance, you don't have matter 5 to create the metamaterial that will stop the destruction ray that's like disintegration ray that's targeting you, but you do have matter 4, and quintessence can help you reshape your shield as it's being destroyed or as the dragon's breath is coming in to pummel it or something like that. The level below that is it lets you do a mundane roll with a bonus. You don't have matter 4 to build a complex item, but you have matter 3, which lets you reshape components to better fit on the fly. And now your craft or jury rig roll is doable in your workshop very quickly. As opposed to it taking weeks of prototyping, you're now able to do it in a couple of hours during a single like montage. Below that, it lets you do a mundane roll that you couldn't before. So for instance, maybe Mind 2, Entropy 1, Forces 2, you're able to make out what someone is saying in a foreign language well enough that you were able to repeat that phrase back to somebody else or something like that, or to get the general gist of a conversation, which you still have to do a perception roll or a wits roll or something with, but Magic just lets you make a roll that you wouldn't be able to do in the first place. And then finally, there's a level at which it merely points to the solution. It doesn't actively solve the problem at all. It just kind of gives you a pointer to a way that you might be able to figure it out. And this is usually 1-dot effects or scrying of some sort. So I kind of cobble those things together, and that's how I adjudicate effects, because I'm trying to have some sort of internally consistent framework. But you notice the weird thing I include is the narrative effect, and we'll get to that more later. So when do you require minimum knowledges for effects?
When the knowledge needed isn't paradigmatic. Yeah, even if your Aetheryte happens to have 0 dots of science, they can be the world's greatest expert in pseudo-etheric physics. It's nonsense. It doesn't have any, it's entirely in paradigm. There's no mundane knowledge component part of it. Now, if their paradigm is that they use some weird offshoot of fluid mechanics, you got to have some science to do that. One of the projects I've been tinkering with is basically giving practices ratings to essentially represent knowledge of the practice, to sort of abstract all of this into one place so that, okay, you're doing something weird with science. Okay, check how many dots of weird science you have versus the spheres you're trying to use. Do you know enough weird science to do it? Have a clear yes or no answer. And this will abstract away all of the paradigm specific knowledge. And some of that will also be related to the practice abilities in the same way that Do has its dependency on the 8 limbs. So yeah, I'm trying to build a system for making this clearer because I run long running games rather than one shots. Complicated house rules are not a problem for me. So I'm trying to make clear where these boundaries lie and put as much information as possible into the Magic system. On the other hand, if you're trying to affect something in a specific way, then often I'll require that you have some understanding of how that thing works. If you just want to break a machine, yeah, well, a baseball bat can do that. You don't need to know anything about how the machine works, really. If you want to make your computer run faster, you need to know a little bit about how to make a computer that runs in order to know where to apply forces correctly or whatnot.
Knowledges are required at minimum, when the target would require understanding for your Magic to interface with it.
Yeah. So for instance, if I want to make my computer run faster, forces 2 plus a few dots of computers would let me make the most important circuits more efficient and so on and so on. Maybe entropy and forces, something like that. Or I could use time 3 and just put it in a fast time bubble. And that doesn't require any knowledge. This is one of those places where how you are getting there determines what the requirements are a little bit.
I frequently say if you had a dim-witted but very handy assistant that you gave the instructions to, if they're able to carry it out, then you're fine. For instance, if you are using matter to make a drug, that's one of those things where it's like, okay, you have this whole lab, a dim-witted assistant, make me caffeine. And they would just be like, This does get you into some weird places. For instance, antibiotics are vastly harder to describe than diamond. But I think in a lot of games, we would rather it require more knowledge to just make diamond than it would to make fluoroquinolone or something.
I actually disagree with that.
Okay.
I would allow diamonds much more easily than any sort of antibiotic, simply because this is one of those, the rules as written are pretty clear. it's hard to get to pure substance than diamond. Matter 2 is all, for instance, is all about messing with pure substances. So
Yeah.
I treat things like diamonds as fairly simple in the knowledge sense, but they might require many successes because it's a precise operation.
Okay. That's reasonable. Yeah, because when I'm doing my narrative physics, as it were, I never want to be in the position where an effect needs to decide or know something. And that is generally where knowledge starts to come in. And that gets into one of the things I have difficulty with. The other thing to note that I think is also important to bring to the table is, as Charles mentioned, I am primarily at this point running one-shots. And Charles, you also run large online games where you kind of want the magic to be a little more self-service.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I'm both okay with complex house rules and can sometimes take very harsh positions on things like what is vulgar is that I often have the goal of players need to be able to adjudicate their own magic roughly how I would have done so were I there. And if there's any doubts about what's going on, then things have to pause and wait for me to show up to make a ruling. But I'd rather that at least there be some unambiguous thing, even if it's complicated, that will tell them what they need to do.
How do you determine the number of successes required to do something?
Vibes.
You say vibes. What are the guidelines for your vibes? How would one do a vibe check?
I do have rules of thumb, but the charts that are in M20 and previous editions of Mage, I mostly don't use them for determining how many successes are needed. I treat them as kind of general directions for what things should make it cost more. But they tend to either end up with numbers that are way too low or way too high for most things, like making some fairly aesthetic effect, like a forces 2, I guess, to make something glow. Making that permanent, being like 6 to 8 successes is completely ridiculous. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to really believe that anything should cost more than like 35 successes. And I don't know about you, but I've had some stubborn players who would sit and do the ritual over and over again until they get that many successes. Because 35 is 35 if you have your difficulty at like 7 and you're willing to burn quintessence and willpower is actually not that much.
Or you have the cult background, which is generally where I get it to go in ridiculous places. Because as an extrovert, I like rewarding players who build communities.
Yeah, so if a character or a cabal has gotten their hands on cult, node, or have high willpower, getting to 35 successes is a very doable thing, especially in a sanctum, where you don't have to worry about that vulgar penalty as long as your magic is staying in the sanctum. I generally rule its vulgarity is the most vulgar point at which it interacts with the world, just to avoid the fireball from my sanctum is safe thing. A lot of things for me are many successes less than the books indicate, but I'm also not afraid of telling players, oh yeah, that's going to be 150 successes. If they really want to do something that's earth-shaking, that everyone will see, they need to work for it. I also tend to impose an arete times willpower success cap, which I could have sworn was in revised somewhere, but last time I mentioned it to you, neither of us could find it.
Yeah. Revised had a few cases where the rule indicating that any sphere, what was it? The difficulty increased based on the number of effects that you're actively maintaining is mentioned twice. And I love this. Once in the core rulebook and once in the book Ascension. That's your alpha and your omega right there.
And I still have questions about what the difference between maintaining an effect, casting an effect that has a duration, and using time for to hang an effect are. And that's a whole bag of worms.
Yes.
Your Arete 3 character, have willpower 10. Why don't you? 30 successes is your limit. You alone are not doing this 150 success ritual. Now, you get 5 of your equally stubborn friends together who have all the appropriate spheres and are willing to work together in this direction. Well, now we've got a mage game. And I have had players who just set off with just completely insane plans that I said would require thousands and thousands of successes. Then the entire game changed from whatever plot I had in mind originally to a deep, hardcore political game trying to get buy-in from enough other mages that they could pull off whatever it was they wanted to do. It also is an explanation to me for how powerful the technocracy can be, because they have an easier time pointing a lot of mages in one direction, and also why the Order of Hermes is powerful, despite the fact that, according to the books, no one, including most of the writers, likes them.
Yeah, if a traditionalist wants to arrange a massive group effort, it either depends on like personal respect or their ability to do a lot of politicking, where an NWO agent can add it to everyone's Microsoft Teams calendar. So that
You need 30 people as a minimum in order to try to get an effect off. The Hermetic starts bargaining favors. The Dream Speaker calls up all their friends, and the NWO agent says, "Oh, I put this on your calendar. We have a meeting.
yeah,
If you aren't there, that's unmutual."
I am looking at 4 factors. 1, scale. Raw, how done big is it? 2, precision. How specific is it? An example I will use. I think a perfectly reasonable usage of Forces 1 is to be able to use small heat differences to figure out where someone you're chasing went. With 1 success, you can figure out what door someone just went through because the handle's slightly warmer or what have you, or you can see the handprint of whatever door they just shoved or something like that. With 2 successes, you can do that, but it's been a little bit more time. It hasn't quite completely equilibrated to room temperature. With 3 successes, you can determine the size of the shoe the person had, and you can use that as useful information. With 4 successes, you can see the trademark that is baked into the sole for any number of shoes that have like Airwalk or something done into it. So to me, that is an effect of increasing precision, so I require more for that. Another one is narrative weight. Again, if someone wants to do something with style, I'm generally only going to require 1 or 2 successes for that. If you want to light a room on fire, 2, 3 successes. If you want it to be on fire in some alchemical pattern or to spell your name, I'm going to require 1 more success, and that's it. Or you spend a point of quintessence, or you spend a point of willpower, like all of them. Any of those resources, I will let you get there. Or if I want to just have a stunt game and I want to reward someone for being cool with it, especially if it's their first time, I just give it to them. And then the 4th one, which is kind of hard for me to explain, is how out of paradigm is it? You will frequently run into cases where a character is like, oh, I have no example of a traditional English witch doing this. To me, should take 1 or 2 successes more than if a character where that effect is clearly within their paradigm is attempting to do it, at least for the first time and at least until kind of their paradigm updates. I like the idea that a personal paradigm does evolve over time. So the first time a character does something that they know is theoretically possible, I feel it makes sense to mechanically represent that. Otherwise, we'd have a lot more examples of people kind of like breaking edge. So like, witches move around on brooms. They don't teleport as much. They use portals, like they may use a dolmen or something like that, but just kind of stepping from door to door. It's going to be hard for the character to do that the first time, to figure out their relationships and the sympathetic connections that they want to use. So I may increase the number of successes required by 2 or maybe even double it. That is entirely a home rule. I recognize that.
I do something similar, but I usually just increase the difficulty by 1 for that instead of adding successes. Kind of the inverse of having a rote by the standard rules. I say one other thing that I do for successes is I have a kind of a conservation of difficulty rule, where unless there's something very clever being done to get around a difficulty, the number of successes doesn't change if you attempt to do the same thing with a different set of spheres in some way. The example I give to players, and I say this because this came up during a game and I had to adjudicate it, was it will require the same number of successes to blow up the moon as to kill Luna.
Okay, yeah. And in there, you're referring to the Celestine.
Yes. So killing Luna, the Celestine, cost the same number of successes as physically blowing up the actual moon, the moon in the sky. This came up because one of the players antagonized some werewolves and thought, well, if I just blow up the moon, that should solve this, right? And first off, there was no way they were getting enough successes to blow up the moon. But their plan was to blow up the moon because that seemed like it would be easier than fighting a Celestine. But I'm strongly of the opinion that anything that is diegetic, the 9 spheres can do in some combination. They can't alter a character sheet directly, but they can give you dots in things by giving you that knowledge. But I impose ridiculous numbers of successes on some of the things that people. What if they want to blow up the moon is a gotcha question I've been asked, and also a thing that a player of mine wanted to try once. They did the math, and even in my very large numbers of mages game, there were not enough mages with the appropriate spheres to even have a chance of ever doing it. Which works out if you sit down and do the math on how much energy would be required to actually blow up the moon in real life.
So the other thing is I try and maintain kind of a basic success economy that a success will generally let you get a +1 or -1 difficulty for a one-shot thing, 3 successes for a long-term. Permanent, I generally want to turn that into a merit or require XP or go through the... I've run into a lot of games where people talk about like, oh, my character did all of these long-term projects and they jumped from being 40 to 50 and now they have decked out with magic items and so on. And I'm like, that's a thing that I've encountered at my table a lot. I tend to be very hesitant with allowing things to be permanent. One of the ways I deal with that is unbelief. I believe that unbelief wears away the successes of things, and just about everything. You can make something permanent in the sense that it will keep going, but it does require some sort of magical maintenance in most cases.
Yeah, I'd say the way that I handle permanence is a combination of, okay, you've permanently altered yourself in some way. Congratulations, you have permanent paradox. And the second thing is that if you buy something with XP, I tend not to take it away. If you try to do better body to get yourself physical stats at 5 and you want to make it permanent by getting double the number of successes or whatever, okay. First time you get into a magical fight with someone and their awareness pings that that's up, they're going to counter magic that, and suddenly you're carrying 500 pounds of stuff with strength 2. So be careful. Be careful when you make things permanent because they can go away.
Are you saying that you deal with this with encumbrance rules? Because if so, I salute you, sir.
I may have rolled for falling damage.
I also let players get additional dice instead of a +1, -1, because sometimes you just kind of need a lot of successes. And the mouthfeel of just being able to roll a fistful of dice kind of feels cool. For a lot of the difficulties I am doing and a lot of the dice pools, the two come out to be real close. For most common dice pools, -1 difficulty is better.
I did the math recently, explaining it to someone. If you are at 4 dice and difficulty 6, the expected number of successes is exactly increases by the same amount going to diff 5 and going to 5 dice. The point is that if 4 dice is an average professional's ability in an area and difficulty 6 is average difficulty, then either way you improve is equivalent at that point, which makes it actually a really good place to peg average. Weirdly, I'm praising the World of Darkness dice mechanics for getting something right.
I almost don't care what the character describes, but if at the end of the day they're like, I'm like, what's the effect of this whole thing going to be? They're like, oh, this mind illusion is going to give me -1 to convince this guy to do something. Suddenly I care. It is like, okay, you're great operatic illusion, but it only nets a -1 difficulty. Yeah, you need 1 success or 2 successes. 1 success to get the effect, 2 to make it theatrical, as opposed to if I were to say, well, doing an illusion of this level of refinement, blah, 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 blah. Well, at the end of the day, they're only using it to get like a -2 difficulty or something like that. And that helps me adjudicate the number of successes I feel that are needed. So to tie that back in.
I think the takeaway here is that neither of us use the tables in the book.
Yeah, I don't find it useful, but I like kind of what you say. It gives you a multiplier to use. Yeah, I think the top end and the bottom end sometimes get a little bit weird. I also think the botch math gets real bad with rituals real fast.
Oh, yeah.
Small changes in difficulty and small changes in the number of successes, especially considering the retrade pool is so small, you run into the parlay problem where, since the question then becomes, what are the odds that on none of the rolls that feed into this will you botch? Yeah, you can spend a point of willpower and continue on with an increased difficulty, but that makes a future botch much more likely. So yeah,
I actually run with a house rule that even if you have spent a willpower on a success, you can spend a willpower to cancel a 1 on a narrative roll. That does help control the botch math on rituals a little bit. The fact that rituals botch like that, plus the coordination problem of many mages, is why I am very comfortable saying that, well, that requires 100 successes. Good luck.
It's one of those things where I was really curious where the numbers wound up landing. If you take the default rules for making an item in M20 using Prime 4 and start with the difficulty of 8, which it kind of recommends, if you have an arete of like 5 and you're dealing with the difficulty 8 and you need 20 successes or so, your chances of botching are between a third and a half. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. I included it in the episode where I'm like, there's a number I want to yell about. And that to me just doesn't create an interesting mage world where botching is that common. So I can work with the assumption that people are spending points of willpower to prevent the botch, but then throwing out the project. And that's a real hard thing to dial in, because when you increase your arete by 1 or increase or decrease the difficulty by 1, you're increasing it for all of the rolls. So any of those changes are compounding, which makes it very hard for me as a storyteller to dial in.
Don't think I've ever had a player sit down to build a piece of build a wonder of any sort without an additional pile of quintessence specifically for keeping that difficulty a bit lower because
Yeah.
it's crazy otherwise.
Or you wind up doing it as an extended action within your sanctum or something like that, and suddenly it drops to a difficulty 6. And now, to me, if your character is building a lot of wonders, or you have a character with a wonder sphere, that sanctum background should cost 5 times as much, not twice. It makes it very hard to dial everything in to get kind of the narrative physics and the sense of vague balance that you want, depending on the type of balance you want in the game, whether it is a system balance or a narrative balance. So my next question to you, Charles, is what do you find difficult to adjudicate, if anything, or what do you find difficult to convey to players? Like, what is the hardest part to you in this process?
So one difficulty is what is vulgar is often hard because even if two people think they're following the same rule, they will disagree. I think the only unambiguous rule, and I use unambiguous in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way for determining paradox, is harass yon passerby, where just you find some rando who's not playing mage and ask them, hey, does this sound crazy? And if they say yes, it's vulgar because there's an objective answer. That specific passerby has said yes.
Yes.
Anything else, you can and will end up with disagreements, even if you think you agreed on the premise. This is actually one of the reasons why I tend to be permissive about what spheres can do and harsh about what causes paradox. And part of that is that what price power theme that I run with. Like, mages are racking up paradox left and right in my games because that is one of the themes I'm playing with. But part of it is that, as I said before, I run these large online games. Things need to be able to sort of run when I'm not there. So I have to give the least ambiguous rules I can, and the least ambiguous rules are going to be fairly harsh paradox-wise. For non-perception effects, the first order approximation of the rules I actually end up using is if your character knows for a fact that what they did would not have happened without their intervention, their magical intervention, it was vulgar. So if there's any plausible way it could have just been a coincidence, that's what coincidental magic is. So, for instance, to use the mind sphere, which is one that people often say is very hard to make vulgar, making someone do something they would have done anyway, coincidence. Making them do something they might have done but might not have done, coincidence. Making them do something they wouldn't have done otherwise, that's where the line for vulgarity starts.
Mild-mannered suburbanite takes out knife and attacks their own family member or something like that when they were seemingly in a perfectly fine house life.
Unless, of course, you poke around in their head and they absolutely would have done that.
Yeah.
Actual mild-mannered, not World of Darkness mild-mannered.
Yes.
I also throw in a hard rule of if you are circumventing the power of another supernatural type, that's always vulgar. I had a player once, and I absolutely praise the creativity here. I do not praise the fact that they spent weeks trying to argue with me that this was coincidental. Used life to grow an additional internal organ so that when they drank vampire blood, it would be stored there and they could vomit it up later without being ghouled. Like, creative, great, I love it. It's still vulgar. You're getting around the fundamental nature of vampirism this way. But it was a really cool thing to do, and it really confused the hell out of a vampire.
Yeah, so they created a crop for themselves. That is good. The ingluviers, I believe, is the other term for it.
I don't know either of those terms.
It is generally a non-digestive stomach that is either like when a parent regurgitates, it's not a proper regurgitation, it's not using the same peristaltic muscles, but it basically goes into kind of a pre-stomach. And sometimes it will be used as a mechanical aid where you'll have the crop and then you'll swallow a whole bunch of pebbles if you're a rooster or whatever, and that will grind it up. Yeah, that's a crop.
Yeah, so something like that. As I said, it was a really clever idea. One of the ways that I encourage clever ideas is that if you come up with something really creative, I'll often give you a break on the difficulty or the number of successes required. They succeeded. And the only part I didn't like was that I then had 3 weeks of arguments about whether or not that was vulgar. Just, it's vulgar. You're getting around becoming you did a thing that should make you a ghoul, and then you didn't become a ghoul. You get some paradox for that. Be happy you're not a ghoul.
Yeah. I want to reward cleverness, but I do not want the game to devolve into an attempt to find that this one weird trick to solve things. So to me, being clever allows you to succeed, again, with a complication at a cost or something like that.
Yeah,
so
I give the breaks for real creativity and innovation like that. Part of that is that it is fairly rare for the kind of complex political plots that I tend to run to be solvable with one weird trick.
Yeah.
If they see something in the setup that I made that I did not see and come up with one weird trick, Okay, that means we go to the fallout from you using that one weird trick.
Yeah, if you can beautiful mind your way through this, that's going to have some consequences. I think for me, the general ones where I have the most difficulty is people say magic can do anything. I don't think that's actually the case. To me, for instance, magic generally can't make a choice. To me, there is no easy way to have a rote that lights the most intelligent person in the room on fire or something like that, or a effect that jumps down in order of decreasing charisma or knowledge of Spanish or something like that without the character having stipulated that, or without doing something ridiculous like Mind 5.
Yeah, I was going to just say, like, of course of course the effect can make a decision. Just add Mind 5 to it.
Yeah.
I say magic can do anything, but it's probably not worth it a lot of the time.
Yeah. Likewise, if something filters all space, to me, the magic isn't finding it, you are. What the effect does is it allows you to vastly digest whatever region or volume it is. The magic isn't doing it for you necessarily. I think this is a case where computers have kind of thrown us off. And in a certain way, to me, magic is frequently non-computational in that way. Like magic doing pattern matching kind of fits outside, but then at the same time, I can add an entropy trigger to
I was just saying,
things.
and entropy and data are both going to let you do things like that.
Yeah, which is why I say this is difficult.
As I said a couple times, I fall firmly on the side where magic can do anything with enough spheres and enough successes. I don't remember what the effect was, but I did once tell a player, okay, to do that, you do in fact need mastery of 9 spheres. Like, don't be afraid to say things like that. To say the thing that you are describing requires numbers of spheres and you probably don't have them. Maybe what you want to do is something that just phrasing it in a way that sounds like it's a lot more. You want to kill the most intelligent person in the room. Making your magic make that decision is hard, but doing a fairly simple mind effect will let you tell who the smartest person in the room is, and then you can kill them.
Yeah, I don't, or things that require adjudicate. Let's say something that would be a little bit more difficult, finding the most charming person or something like that. I think a lot of that stuff gets difficult. I think you and I had the conversation, for instance, before of what does scrying mean for unknown facts about the universe? Is there a rote that can give you the answer to the Colot's conjecture? And your answer is yes. It just so happens that the focus for that is the proof. Where contemporaneously we have the ideas that come out. The Colot's conjecture famously is a open mathematical question that a lot of people look at it and go, we are not going to solve this in the next millennia, let alone the next decade or something like that. People are frequently what I consider to be hyperbolic about it. But it's one of those things where a lot of people point at it and go, this hard.
I will also make the distinction between an unknown fact about the universe and an unknown fact of logic. For the universe, we have to pick a paradigm. But let's say within the technocratic paradigm, we want to know the answer to, is there a smallest atomic particle? That, I think, is a fundamentally different sort of question than, is the Riemann hypothesis true?
Interesting. Okay. So those are things I find to be difficult to adjudicate. Describing the effects of temporal scrying, I usually find hard. And if it is retrodicting, it is frequently you get to ask questions. If it's predicting, it is dice that you get to use later or questions you get to ask later as you go, oh, that's what this is.
So one way that I've handled things like that in the past is basically tokens that can be turned in for, well, I saw this coming, so I prepared for it. So like you get 3 successes on your Scry the Future roll, then 3 times over the rest of the story, you can say, I saw this coming, so I brought X. Okay, you have X now.
And finally, a lot of things about mind I have difficulty with, partially because it is a sphere I'm generally uncomfortable with. I am fine with things that are influences. Basically, a lot of the mind stuff that you could really accomplish with life, where you just kind of make someone mad, or you're just like, I'm just going to mess with that person's chemistry. Like anytime I can point at a neuroatomical correlate or well-known mechanism that would cause it, I'm usually fine with it. But some of the things regarding, are you opposing their willpower roll, or are you using their willpower as a difficulty, which kind of co-ops the whole like vulgarity schema in the same way that if you use a bit of spirit and suddenly we're using the gauntlet rating for everything.
I will say I ignore both of those entirely and let vulgarity determine difficulty. I tend to use the gauntlet rating in a not direct way, but essentially as number of successes to cross to step. Like if the gauntlet's 3, you can step sideways for 1 success. If it's 9, you need 5. Something like that. And I don't use willpower ever as a difficulty because again, that just ends up being a mess with the systems, and I feel like it shouldn't have been introduced in the first place.
Yeah, I generally prefer, so to explain two things. One of the implications one can get from the idea that the spirit sphere is required to do a lot of effects because you're having a spirit notionally do it for you is suddenly the gauntlet rating is going to influence how difficult that effect can be. And to me, narratively, that doesn't necessarily generate the game I want. So I use the standard vulgarity there, even if I were to say it required spirit. And regarding mind, there is some things have represented that you use the target's willpower as a difficulty, and frequently mortals would have a willpower of like 3, which makes a lot of these things absolutely trivial, which is actually great if that's the game you want, where mortals are your playthings, but generally I prefer to have it the mage's arete versus a difficulty versus the mortal's willpower against a difficulty, and the difficulty is determined basically by how inclined they are and how subtle the mage is being. And that influences the difficulty. So I like giving mortals a fighting chance, and that's one of those.
So we're in agreement here.
Yeah.
Another thing to keep in mind is that other supernaturals often have willpower of like 3 or 4. Mages are high willpower compared to everyone else.
Yeah.
And even then, like, do you really want messing with other mages to be difficulty 5?
Maybe mages do have the benefit of counter magic if they know what's happening. It is one of those things where it is both highly realistic that a mage would essentially form a cult of personality where everyone kind of likes them, but at the same time, that's just kind of one of those things I'm skeeved out about that I just don't want in my damn game. So I'm willing to change the system to get there. What are, as you are an extensive homebrewer, are there any simple systemic rules modifications you make that you think people looking for slightly simpler games or slightly more interesting games could implement that are not like full rewrites?
I think in previous episodes, I've said that I move around powers within a couple of the spheres. I make astral projection mind 3. I make telepathy mind 4. And I make, pumping your mental stats mind 3 because that balances mind better and encourages the whole mages travel astrally through the Umbra thing that the book suggests.
My big ones are frequently I will include environmental assists. If the characters need to do a thing, and it is frequently the case that if the characters have the appropriate spheres, the thing that they are trying to do would become trivial. But frequently I will include environmental boosts where the characters need a lower level sphere to activate something at a higher level. So the idea is to destroy the incoming asteroid would require forces 5 or something like that. But you can use a forces 3 effect to prime the ignition chamber. So I try and create these environmental cases where the characters more or less get temporary access to what is functionally a wonder that is keyed to another magical effect. And this allows me to kind of write hall passes and say that there is something about the world that is justifying their use. If the characters don't quite have the sphere to do the spheres to do the particular thing they're trying to do, to enact the curse that you're trying to do is not possible because you don't have entropy 4. But what I'm going to say is that your knowledge of entropy 3 means that you can interface with the spirit of destiny or fate that this character has wronged, and that is proof of competence that allows you to do this other effect. So I write a lot of little hall passes like that because sometimes you'll run into a thing where it's like, yeah, I think it would be really cool to go out with a bang on this effect, and it's like, yeah, oh man, that's an awesome idea. And now you've kind of set the bar to use in the future. That's a real hard thing for me to take back. So I try to have a diegetic reason that a lower level sphere was able to pull something off.
There is one thing I do that messes with the difficulty that is fairly easy to bolt onto other systems. I use a simplified resonance system. So the resonance and synergy system in M20 is complicated.
I find it obtuse. I find it difficult to understand what it's trying to say.
So essentially, I slide back to the revised version as seen in Fallen Tower Las Vegas. In revised, I even kind of stripped those down a little bit. Resonance is adjectives that describe your magic, rated from 1 to 5. Each dot adds or subtracts 1 to difficulty up to that maximum of +3 or -3 total for magic whenever you do an effect. This both makes some very hard things easier and some very easy things harder, but also it really strongly guides players towards what kinds of magic they are going to do. Like a character who has fiery resonance is going to reach for fire more often when they're doing forces. It helps them figure that stuff out a lot. And it makes it easier to adjudicate because, well, if nothing else, they're more consistent in what they're doing, which means that you have to make fewer new rulings and remember fewer rulings. I like the fact that Mage is wide open and you can do all sorts of things and come up with new things on the fly that are not like anything you've ever done before. But you don't need to do that every single time. And through a combination of rote rules, which there's several different versions floating around, including mine, the resonance rules, I strongly recommend some version of the revised rules because they were much, much clearer and simpler. Those difficulty benefits or dice pool benefits or whatever is happening will channel players to build specific magical styles that do the same sorts of things regularly. And if you're adjudicating 3 new effects per session instead of 12, that makes things a lot easier.
Yeah. We also received some listener questions. I've combined some. How do you come up with effects for NPCs? The way I do this, I tend to have a few keystone effects that a person can do and work backwards from that. For instance, I had an Incan character that had a prepared effect where they could create a small animated army of spirit figurines, and that's likely Prime 2, Matter 4, Spirit 2, and fire forces 2 in the case of one of their's ability to breathe fire. So I kind of took that effect and broke it down. For NPCs where magic is going to be a thing, the 2 questions I try and ask is, what are they going to be able to counter, and what is their keystone effect? What is the cool thing that they could do? How about you, Charles?
I do something similar. I take the NPC, figure out what are they about. Is that this character is a politician? Okay, so they've got this short list of mind effects, probably very subtle ones. They're probably not throwing fireballs around. That's a different kind of politics. Generally speaking, NPCs in my games are less able to come up with new things on the fly than PCs. That's mostly because there's one player running running a character, whereas I'm running all the NPCs. But it also reinforces a little bit that the PCs are special. Even in the big online games that I like to run, the PCs are still special. I run a high number of Mage's World, but there's still only like 20 player characters at a time or something, like when it's a fairly large game. So they're coming up with new things on the fly a lot more easily than other people are. NPCs in my games tend to pick more from rote lists, and then they modify those rotes as they need in order to accomplish their goals. I'm generally much more willing to let NPCs go off book for rituals that they have plenty of time to plan for. The NPC has this one big effect, done it a few times. Everyone knows that that's their thing. Increasing the effect in some way by adding additional spheres or whatever, but they're doing it as a ritual, that's fine, no problem. They want to do it on the fly. Usually, I don't have them do that. Stick to a list that I generated in advance, just partly because, and with no false modesty, I have substantially higher system mastery than the average player. Mm-hmm. So me going all out with letting an NPC use the rules in the way that I would let players use them is kind of unfair.
Well, it's also system mastery of your system to some extent.
I mean, part of it is that the average player has read, a chunk of the core book, whereas I have at least once read every single Mage book. I helped write one. Like, I have a very high level of system mastery compared to the average person who is sitting down to play Mage.
Yes, that is not a brag, by the way.
Yeah, and then there's my game where I make the rules. Treating an NPC like a PC and their ability to exploit those rules is just wildly unbalanced, because the same person coming up with ideas is the person who adjudicates whether they work.
What do you do with effects that seemingly break the world, like mages throwing fireballs from their chantries? This is a similar question of one person asking, a lot of the basic effects seem like they could break the world if you decided to use them as written. One of the most obvious ones to me would be something like, hey, I'm going to use correspondence plus matter, turn the air in someone's lungs into iron, or something like that. That's a pretty common something of like that. How do you deal with that?
Doing something inside of a life pattern, so you need life for that. Like, as much as I sometimes complain about how many conjunctional spheres M20 tends to need,
yeah,
some of that is actually important game balance.
Mm-hmm.
things like you can't just turn the air in someone's lungs into steel. You need life also in order to even try. And then you're rolling damage. It's a very complicated way of getting to do damage to someone, but it's impressive and fun. I don't think of that one as really breaking the world. If you don't have enough successes to kill them, then some of the air, like their lungs are messed up, but they're still standing. Definitely going to be aggravated damage though. As for the fireball from the chantry, step one is the vulgarity is the most vulgar place where it occurs. That's almost always going to be vulgar, unless you're shooting into another chantry of your tradition, in which case you have other problems too.
My response was going to say, in which case, game on. But
yeah,
yes.
Basically, game on. There's a reason that the Order of Hermes, in Ars Magica, didn't get together until the Parma Magica was created.
Yeah. The idea was you're not going to get a bunch of mages to work together unless you have a way to prevent mages from doing stuff to other mages.
Then the next thing is, you need successes, but working in your sanctum, that's not a problem. Knowing that other people could do it to you. I know that there was some criticism of mutually assured destruction.
It works. It sometimes.
It works to an extent. I actually have used the fact that it doesn't always work as a plot point where characters from one city were visiting another one and found it fairly depopulated of mages. And they eventually figured out that someone kind of broke that unwritten rule and everyone ended up dead. Actually, this was after I knew you, and it was mages from New York who were trying to figure out why there were only 4 mages in Philadelphia. There once were more, but someone cast Core 3, Forces 3, Prime 2, and then everyone did it, and now there's 4 mages left.
The other way to take it, as Charles kind of suggests, is within anything, we can either make the system harder, or we can say, is there something within the game world that would prevent this from happening? And this is something that, to me, I want to have a discussion with the players, because anytime the player does something particularly clever, to me, we are adding to the canon of things that can now happen in the world, that characters of that type with those spheres and that paradigm can also do that thing. So before the show, Charles and I were talking about how major political leaders within the world of darkness likely have a very big target on their back, and considering the number of supernatural powers running around, America would be on its 400th or 500th president as various night folk try and take them out, or alternatively be in the 72nd term of Richard Nixon or something like that, as it turns out that he's a Methuselah or something like that. So to me, the other question is there an in-world answer to the question? And sometimes we just say, no, this isn't possible. Another thing that we can say is there is some counterbalancing force in the world that prevents it. In my games, I generally have the technocracy kind of responsible for protecting high-ranking political figures. I've also indicated that there are a lot of magical devices that kind of make most politicians immune to mind effects once they are above like a certain level. I had a plot device in one of my games where the enchantment that caused it was let ye who determine the fate of men be immune from the machinations within their own minds. And in the game, that had resulted not from politicians being immune to it, but now CEOs started to be, as in many cases they had vastly more power than that. So we can come up with in-game explanations. The other question we can say is, okay, do we really want to set this as a thing that happens in the world? And then if so, you kind of run with that. The other thing is a lot of the examples I see of cheese run into very strong paradigmatic problems where it's like, okay, what character believes they can do that? And with that, I'm going to roll it into my next question is, how do you guide players through what they can't do, either from a sphere perspective or from a paradigmic perspective?
I don't run one-shots, but I still end up onboarding lots of new players because someone picks up Mage and then they go look for online games because they don't have friends who know Mage yet. This has resulted in me having a fairly robust system of, at character creation, you should have this many rotes, and also tell me 3 things that your character thinks are impossible. They don't have to be things that your character could do with their current spheres. Usually, people will pick things that require spheres at 5 or whatever, because, okay, maybe resurrection is impossible. Maybe, only God can create a human soul. Whatever that even means in game, but a list of things that they do not believe can be accomplished through magic. Then they have the opportunity to change one of those things every time they go up in Arete, and above Arete 5, they get the choice of adding new things that are impossible and becoming more powerful in the things that they're doing. I like trade-offs after Arete 5 rather than just the standard, there are spheres above 5 from Masters of the Art. So I tend to have, there's different things you can do, and you kind of pick which path your character is going to go on. But you stop changing out what these things are, and you either add to them and become more powerful in the things you still believe you can do, or you subtract from them and you become more versatile. So, like your Arate 6 mage may now only believe that 2 things are impossible with magic, or they may believe that 4 things are impossible, but this other thing that they do believe is possible is now at -1 difficulty.
I generally have the opposite experience where characters believe their character's paradigm are sufficiently constrained that they can't do anything, or that they feel that there is a very narrow range of what they can do. And I say, do you think your character has encountered another person that did something that was close to your paradigm that may do it? So I am frequently in the other position. But yeah, I will pick 2 or 3 things where you say, hey, what do you think your character just flat out can't do or would ever be able to do within it? And if we want to have the paradigm change over the course of it, we certainly can. But I find it interesting that I'm generally in the opposite position where it's like, well, there is no spirit for this within my paradigm of worshiping the anglicized version of the Norse gods, or like Wotan or something like that. And I'm like, well, let's be a little bit creative. Let's add a little bit of creativity to that. Do you think there's a lost story or something that includes a member of the Aesir or the Vanir or something that no one had ever heard of? Who is it? What did they do? What's one of the stories that they did? So I frequently wind up going the other way. How do you deal with time magic and the fact that the paradox involved is often onerous?
I ignore that.
Yeah. I generally don't allow time travel.
I absolutely allow time travel. I just use the standard paradox rules, and instead of paradox being like 8 million, instead it's and now everyone wants to kill you.
Yeah, the real consequences are the enemies we made along the way. Just as a note, within M20, every time you turn back time, paradox is tripled. There's mandatory minimums for that. So if you wind up doing it twice, it multiplies it by a factor of 9. So at 3 points, you cease to exist, which is a bit much.
I just give the standard amount of paradox, and now you have to deal with the fact that all the other people who have time 5, who had agreed we're not time traveling, that's a mess, are on you. Like there's a lot of sort of détentes in my mage games.
Yes, or there's a temporal invariance authority or something.
We call them the void engineers.
Yeah, I generally have it to be a weird set of misfits. Wrinkles Angels would probably be narratively closer, but yes.
I used that as a plot once where literally the PCs were tapped by Wrinkle to go stop a Nefandus who went back in time. It was a way to run Sorcerer's Crusade for a couple weeks.
Yeah, not unreasonable. What are the levels you feel of background sympathetic connections between mages, and is it in some way warded? Do you feel that mages have common artifact spells or services that they trade amongst themselves in fixing of sympathetic wards and ties? I think the idea is mages work with each other a lot and deal with each other's stuff a lot. Do you think there is a war for mages to protect their sympathetically tied things to prevent other people from getting the dirt on it? Or do you think that is kind of a way of trading favors?
One thing I did like in Mage the Awakening First Edition is how knowing someone's real name is a huge I like the true names thing, and I tend to think of one of the things that indicates that the Cabal is particularly close is that they know each other's actual names, even though mages in Mage the Ascension don't canonically have like shadow names in the way that Awakening mages do. I tend to think that they're mostly operating under assumed names when they're dealing with other mages, because that's just smart. Other mages are dangerous weirdos.
Mages that last long, even if they don't start out with assumed names, probably quickly realize that it's a good idea when they have to leave town the first time.
Yeah, maybe technocrats do less of that because, their job is to be mages.
Mm-hmm.
They live inside of that. It's different. The people who would be able to do the most damage to you by knowing your name are like your hiring manager. So they know your social security number. They can do so much worse than just knowing your name.
Mm-hmm. For a lot of effects, your social security number to me very much is your true name.
I have used social security number as a true name. I've used IP address or MAC address of a computer as a true name. I'm flexible about what is a true name, as long as it's a usually secret, unique identifier for the person.
I think my favorite was the one that was introduced and revised, the idea that your true name is the set of karmic stains that you still have for a member of the Akashiyana.
Absolutely. For me, true names kind of work almost on a Demon the Fallen rules, where you have a true name. People can kind of work out syllables of it. It's not necessarily the name that you go by every day, though.
Mm-hmm.
Just this name is who you are.
Another one that the same questioner brought up is, do you think that mages should have a high innate level of magic resistance so that they need to rely on more mundane weapons when dealing with each other, or work through agents?
Nope.
Yeah.
I think that the reliance on more mundane methods is because Dex plus firearms is going to be like 7 dice, and Arate is going to be like 3.
Oh yeah, especially if you use the revised rules for splitting up pools. If you did that right, that's 27 damage dice without too much difficulty. And that's with the starting level character. To me, the Ascension War, the fact that it is relatively easy to pick up sympathetic connections to other people is the reason why you generally do fighting through peons or indirectly. You want to have plausible deniability. You can only be in one place at one time until you get correspondence 4. The thing about being a mage, it allows all of your less let's roll damage abilities to be force multipliers. Suddenly your ability to see through time, or your ability to gather extrasensory information, or to project your senses into other places, and then have a set of hirelings, minions, and so on to work through, allows you to vastly expand your capacity. I have a character that very much harps on this in Bizarre Magic, and I very much hope that character made it through editing. But yeah.
So one of the consequences of me using the revised resonance rules for things is that your magical fingerprint is very recognizable.
Mm-hmm.
So people don't need magic resistance in order to make it a good idea to, you want to kill someone, hit them with a car. Okay, you just killed this guy with a fireball, and everyone looks at it and says, oh, well, this person has, moderately strong fiery resonance and a little bit, jerk resonance. Clearly it's Bob the chorister. Let's go beat him up.
I like the idea, though, of resonance being diegetic and being like, oh, Mark picked up 2 points of asshole resonance, or something like that.
It's like, you get to the magic, you sniff, smells like asshole.
Yep.
And then everyone looks at you like, you sure you want to phrase it that way?
Yep.
It's specifically described in Mage as sort of a magical fingerprint. It's in Revised. It's expected that characters will pick up several different resonance traits over the course of doing significant amounts of magic. And avoiding doing magic keeps your resonance minimal. It keeps your resonance from spreading around. It means that people won't associate that resonance with you specifically. There's a lot of incentive to not use magic to do things that mundane methods will work for. And that's also another reason not to fireball people from your sanctum. Suddenly, everyone knows that you're the one doing that.
And with that, Charles, we have talked about adjudication. It seems very appropriate that I should mention that you have done 2 things that can help with adjudicating effect. One is the Enlightened Grimoire, which packs in darn near every rote that I know about, and converts the sphere requirements to M20, as well as the creatively named and directly named the 9 spheres.
It is the 9 spheres, and it continues to be so despite several people asking me, so are you going to expand it to include the technocratic spheres? To which the answer is no.
If you're interested in following what Charles is up to, again, as we mentioned at the top of the show, link to Charles' Patreon is in the show notes, and we will be hearing from Charles shortly about Charles' publication, Magickal Capital. Magickal Capital, a book on some firms you can add to your game to justify high resources within the traditions. Charles, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. I'm always glad to be here.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where if you asked us really, really nicely if something required 20 successes, we'd say, no. For you, 30. I'd like to thank those who have allowed us to make over 200 episodes so far, seemingly without paradox, and they include executive producers, Jay Widener, Oracle of Figuring Out If Something is Vulgar, Josh Hillerup, Oracle of Determining Intervals on Rituals, Buck Gregory, Oracle of Arguing Over Whether or Not Something Needs Mind 3, Christopher Phillips, Oracle of Remembering When to Roll Against Willpower as a Pool or as a Difficulty, The Crew of Erebus, Oracle of Letting Someone Fudge the Roll because it's school night and everyone needs to leave by 10 p.m., and Mikhail, Oracle of Forgetting How Many Successes Someone Has Gotten So Far and just saying, you only need 2 more, buddy. Additionally, I'd like to thank Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anand, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Boo, Boogers to the Six, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsek, Fragger Rock, Gargle Noir, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Julian Andes, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Nubero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klimanoff, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Robbie, Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shout-out is to Rachel Grace, who, when I Google boy, are there a lot of people with that name running around. I prefer to assume that they're all the same person and that our show is supported by someone who is a award-winning R&B artist and electric violinist known for their intimate sound, a deputy editor at Cracked Magazine, one of Ireland's preeminent songwriters, the chief people officer at Concerto Care, and a guide to you and your organization's journey to mindfulness and insight. Thank you for your support. If you happen to be the Rachel Grace that died tragically in August of 2020, thank you for your posthumous support. If you'd rather listen to us on YouTube or share it with your friends that way, search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop-in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye. Outtakes. And this is coming from someone familiar with the idea of Talmudic scholarship, and that is to say Charles. So
I can comment on the comments only so many times before I need my own podcast, and I'm not doing the audio editing. I looked in on that channel periodically and decided, you know what? I don't need to be here.
I take those, I summarize them elsewhere. For episode channels, I try and keep it slightly on target, but it was a case where Charles said, I'm ignoring the thread. I'm just not going to look at it. I'm like, this one was pretty on target. I looked at it like 25, 30 minutes ago. It was fine. And by the time I got to it, it was an argument over like who was the true leader of the Plantagenet dynasty or something like that. And I'm like, oh no, I have spoken too soon. Yeah. As opposed to in my game where, yeah, you'll run into a limit because both mages that exist may not have the appropriate spheres.
Yeah. Resonance and Nukes. It's the greatest mage book ever written.
It has some really neat opening fiction, and it is a book that really grew on me over time.
Yeah, but it also does have a certain aspect of it that is kind of a grab bag of things they were shoving in at the end. There's always a sketchy dark elf who might be able to do so.
Yes, there's always a sketchy elf. Put that as part of the Mage the Podcast t-shirt line.
Like, Porthos started the American Revolution. How? He shot someone. You know?
Exactly. He's like the Forrest Gump of Mage the Ascension.
The shot heard around the world? That was Porthos.
Yeah, it was a correspondence effect that made it, actually. It was literally audible everywhere. I do like the idea of effects having out-of-game tags to it, being like, the person who casted this has 2 points of rules lawyer resonance to it.
I did actually give a character rules lawyer resonance once. This was due to a high umbral trip where they were arguing with Incarnate about what the ban of the Incarnate actually means.
We have run Mage. Yep. Mage, not even once. I also always want to insert the line of, remember when you cast a communal effect, you're casting a communal effect with every mage that mage has ever cast a communal effect with. It just doesn't, it is the opposite of humor, which is why whenever I bring up my podcast to my spouse, she's like, oh yeah, that sounds fascinating to the antique mandolin restoration community or whatever it is you talk about. I did a lot of talking.